Eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Cat, pedindo desculpas mais uma vez por minha absoluta incapacidade de pronunciar o nome da sua universidade. Eu peço desculpas e peço que, por favor, se apresente e complemente alguma informação que eu tenha deixado de lado. 20 minutos, por favor.
Thank you very much. So it's Cathy Albertine, which is an Afrikaans name. And the university that I'm at is the University of the Witwatersrand, which is an Afrikaans word, which is the Dutch language in South Africa, and it means ridge of white waters. And it's in the gold reef-bearing part of the country, which is Johannesburg. So in this paper, I'm going to, I think, tell you the story of changing abortion law reform in South Africa and the different kinds of ideas that have underpinned the different laws and the groups of women who have been included and excluded by those laws. We do, at the moment, have a very progressive law, and I'll talk a little bit about that and how it's been implemented. And I'll talk a little bit about where we need to go now in South Africa. So I'm hoping it'll be interesting because I'm assuming that most of you are not familiar with what's happened there, and I think that there are lessons in South Africa for Brazil because we are a little bit ahead of you in terms of law reform, but things are absolutely not perfect in South Africa. So I'm going to talk about the pre-democracy apartheid era law, which is quite similar to what was described in Brazil at present. And then I'm going to talk about the reforms post-democracy in the 1990s and the opportunities for that, and the way in which we were able to bring in a very progressive choice-based law and the conditions that enabled that. And then I'm going to share with you the way in which that expanded and constrained access and the problems that we are facing now, 17 years later, of diminishing access and why. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm really interested in, which is the sort of the political and legal development of reproductive freedom in South Africa in 2014. And if I don't get through all of that, then we can do some of it in discussion. So in South Africa, abortion has always been permitted in some form. Under African customary law, it was permitted and tolerated in different ways. It had various names, and it happened because, like Brazil, South African women have always voted with their feet. When they want to terminate a pregnancy, in South Africa we say termination of pregnancy, not abortion. It was a choice we made in the 1990s. We thought it would make it more palatable to the anti-choice people. Didn't work. And then in our common law, which was Roman Dutch law, abortion was always permitted if the life of the mother was under threat. But in the 1970s, there had been a significant rise in unsafe and backstreet abortions and a significant rise in women claiming abortions. And the doctors that were providing abortions to those women, normally middle-class women, were also beginning to feel the wrath of the criminal prosecutors because, of course, a lot of those abortions that women were asking for were not abortions based on the risk of the life of the mother. They were abortions because women wanted them for all kinds of reasons. And there was a spate of prosecutions of doctors. So abortion law reform in the 1970s was actually led by health and legal professionals trying to find certainty in the law, so to expand and control access. And of course, elsewhere in the world, abortion laws were also being enacted in the UK and Roe versus Wade, of course, in the United States. So there was some expansion of abortion rights for women, and South Africa, despite being a very conservative, morally conservative society, followed suit, driven by doctors' concerns for their own legal safety. So a law was presented to Parliament in a very particular policy context. And the policy context coming from the then apartheid government was, we are not condoning abortion on request. We are registering respect for the unborn and Christian morals. Nor we are not condoning illegitimate births or extramarital pregnancies. We are only providing therapeutic abortions on the basis of medical necessity and what I call blameless sex. Very similar to what was being described in Brazil. If women could only get abortions if they were victims of circumstance, right? So either they had been raped or were the victims of incest, or there was some kind of medical necessity relating to the physical and psychological health of the mother and of the fetus. Now, the way in which the provisions were written actually could be interpreted quite progressively, and the United Kingdom had very similar provisions that enabled quite wide access for women. But in South Africa, those provisions were constrained by very stringent medical and public health bureaucracy procedures. So you could only secure abortions at particular hospitals, and you needed signatures of doctors, etc. So I imagine, similar to Brazil now, access to abortion was controlled very much by doctors and by the public health bureaucracy. But it was very much an idea of women's agency was absolutely nowhere. It wasn't politically argued. There was a very, very small group of white women in the parliamentary hearings who asked for abortion on request in the first 12 weeks to reduce the danger of backstreet abortion. So the choice was very much linked to backstreet abortion. It wasn't an issue in and of itself. But generally, it was medically led, and if women had a choice, had engaged in sex by choice outside of marriage, God forbid, and fell pregnant, well, then she was expected to live with the consequences of that choice. So a very liberalized, abstract idea of choice, no sense of the circumstances in which women lived. And the subject of the rights in that law were white women, without question, even though it was a law that was open to all women in South Africa. It was largely white women who were able to access terminations, and I have statistics, but I won't. Yeah, you can have them if you want. Those white women were also policed in terms of a particular moral propriety. As I've shared with you, the notion of abortion for victims. So black women were, and particularly poor black women, while they formally had the right, were in practice unable to secure access, largely because partly it was a very difficult procedure to negotiate. Secondly, because most abortions were carried out on the basis of psychological grounds, and there were only 2 urban hospitals where you could do it. So if you didn't live in those 2 big cities, or if you lived in rural areas, it really wasn't possible for you. You would have thought that the National Party would have liked to have abortions for black women because they were interested in reducing the black population, but they did that through racist population policies and contraception control. So there's a whole history of controlling the fertility of black women, but it was through contraception, not through broadening access to abortion. So it was all women who suffered under that act, but particularly poor black women, and particularly those were the women who put their lives and their health at risk through securing backstreet abortion, because as in Brazil, there were huge numbers of backstreet abortions that were happening. At one point, they thought 1 in every 10 women presenting at a public hospital in Durban was actually presenting in the gynecological ward as a result of an unsafe abortion. Now, despite the situation, there were, of course, prior to 1990s, no real political struggles and political mobilization around the right to abortion. There was a very, very small 2 small groups of white women who engaged the white state to broaden the right to abortion. And in fact, doctors who were beginning to see the consequences of backstreet abortion were beginning to advocate for abortion on request. But generally, under apartheid, it was very limited. And in the national liberation struggle, it was not seen to be a priority. Getting rid of apartheid was the priority, and women's issues really were not until the late 1980s seen to be a priority. And it was actually seen to be a white woman's issue. Very much at that particular point in time. At the same time, recent evidence coming out of the ANC in exile, the African National Congress in exile, the experience of women in exile and in the camps there, is beginning to show that, particularly after 1976, where there was a huge exit of young people from the country after the Soweto riots, that issues of gender-based violence, of sexual coercion, of high levels of unwanted and unplanned pregnancies, and of unsafe abortion began to emerge in those camps. And many of the senior ANC women, seeing the consequences of this for young women, in places like Zambia and Angola, where your resort to abortion was normally illegal and unsafe, came back into the country in 1990 with a strong commitment to legalizing abortion in South Africa because they'd seen the consequences of it firsthand. So there was a politics around abortion, but it wasn't visible and it wasn't public. But certainly by 1990, there were strong feminist leaders who believed that this is a law that we should pass after 1990. So you would know from Brazil as well that the conditions of the transition to democracy open a very particular space for the reform of women's laws, for the insertion of feminist demands, gender equality, and women's human rights. Also in the early 1990s, you will know, some of you, that there were growing global claims for reproductive rights, and the population conference in Cairo and the declaration that came out of that conference began to talk for the first time about abortion not as a kind of population issue, but as a reproductive health and reproductive rights issue, and the right of women to decide when to terminate their pregnancies. And South African women were very involved in the Cairo Declaration. So there was this synergy between local and global, if you like. So in the early 1990s, there were significant claims from 1990 from ANC women and from feminists in the country for the inclusion of reproductive rights of one of the women's demands for inclusion in the Constitution. And women within the ANC were able to ensure that the ANC draft Bill of Rights and the ANC health policy included demands for reproductive rights. And there were many of us within the country working in women's human rights and women's health who were also advocating from about 1992 for human rights. We were particularly concerned with securing a constitutional framework and with getting a progressive law in place. And the key drivers of that were, on the one hand, a feminist demand for choice. Women have moral autonomy, should have the choice to decide whether to be able to terminate or not. But perhaps more compelling arguments and more strategic arguments were the social concerns around health and the consequences of backstreet abortion and the racialized access of the current law, the fact that we could argue that it was racially discriminatory, that black women were unable to secure access. So there was an insistence on women's choice in the context of unequal social relations, but the much more popular arguments, and it was a strategic choice we made at the time, and I think partly it's come back to bite us, but I'm not sure we could have made another choice, was really to focus on the social, historical, and moral arguments around health and racial inequality, rather than a kind of feminist assertion of agency. So that's really, those were the arguments we made. There was significant civil society activism around it. And in South Africa, we secured in the 1996 Constitution a very important provision, which is that everyone has the right to bodily and psychological integrity, which includes the right to reproductive decision-making and the right to security and control over your body. So a very important constitutional standard. It's not directly saying you can terminate pregnancies, but it was subsequently interpreted to be that. And then in 1996, we passed the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act, which at the time was regarded to be the most progressive law in the world, which allowed abortion on request up to 12 weeks, abortion on the basis of certain medical and social conditions between 12 and 20 weeks. Those related to the health of the woman, the health of the fetus, rape and incest and HIV, but also socioeconomic circumstances. The difference between those provisions in 1996 and 1970 was that no doctor had to tick a box. That if a woman said, I'm securing an abortion for one of these reasons, she got the abortion. So essentially in South Africa, abortion on request up to 20 weeks, and after that, in very limited circumstances, no spousal consent and no parental consent, which is quite controversial. So the subject of that law really were all women, and particularly focused on poor black women as a constituency. And it was particularly to solve the problem of their exclusion and the health consequences of exclusion. But what's been interesting in terms of implementation over the past 17 years is that poor black women have remained an excluded group. So, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. So while initially there was a significant expansion of access and a significant reduction in unsafe abortion, not necessarily in illegal abortion, but in unsafe abortion, and in maternal illness and death. So we were able to, the law was praised after 5 years and after 8 years because it was actually meeting some of the health needs, and women were able to secure it. All along, it was very apparent that access was very uneven, that women in rural areas were still not being able to access the services, that the services tended to be limited to urban areas, and that those people who were securing backstreet abortions were still largely excluded. And most recently, in meetings that we've held over the last year, in fact, now there's been an increase in maternal deaths again. So there's regression, and there's been reduced access as conscientious objection by health workers begins to bite, and sites that were previously designated are no longer designated. So why have we experienced this? How much time have I got left? Okay. Well, why have we experienced this? I want to talk a little bit about that. South Africa has always been a morally conservative society, despite this fabulous law that was passed. And it's become, there's a kind of growing traditionalism, if you like, a growing conservatism in our society. So the ideas of choice and equality that were underlying the Act were never ideas that were supported by the majority of society or even by a substantial minority, despite the fact that women nevertheless vote with their feet, even if they say they don't agree with abortion. When they need an abortion, or their daughter needs an abortion, or their sister needs an abortion, they will go and have one. So there is that problem. There is also reduced civil society activism. And I think what's the lesson in South Africa is civil society activism was critical to putting the law in place in the first place, and also to defending a number of challenges, because what happened in South Africa was as soon as the law was in place, we faced a number of conservative challenges, legal challenges to the Act. So the first one would have been, well, women don't have the right to terminate because fetuses have constitutional rights. That was the first one. It was lost. The second one was minors should not be able to decide to have abortions without the consent of their parents, because minors are incapable of taking these kinds of decisions. That was also lost on the basis of reproductive autonomy and informed consent. And there was a lot of health activism, health NGOs working with government to expand access to services, to train midwives, to support midwives who work in a very judgmental environment. And a lot of that has died, and with it access has died. And there's now a kind of a sense of wanting to resuscitate that activism, because we realize that without that activism, women's access declines, because you can't leave it up to the state. We also now, for the first time, have a Minister of Health who doesn't agree with abortion in his heart. So he doesn't say I'm anti-choice, but he doesn't really act. So the abortion services in hospitals are kind of at the back, with windowless rooms, divorced from comprehensive reproductive health care services, and he's not really advancing it. And then finally, we just have systemic problems in our health system, that after apartheid, the health system needed to be reoriented from a kind of white tertiary health system to a primary healthcare system that served everyone. And there have been huge problems in trying to make that work. So some of the problems with reproductive health services are problems of transformation of the legal system. And within the health system, there's lots of conscientious objection. There's health workers are terribly stigmatized and are not supported, so tend to withdraw from helping. So the number of people prepared to terminate pregnancies is reducing. There is only one doctor in the country who will do second trimester abortions at the moment in the Western Cape, and maybe one in Gauteng. So if you present after 12 weeks, there is no access. And the users are stigmatized and judged by the health workers, and many people would prefer to go to the back street. The irony in South Africa is I can drive home from university and I can see advertisements for abortions and penis enlargement on the dustbins. And those are all for backstreet abortions, mostly unsafe. I can't anywhere see an advertisement for a safe, legal, public health abortion, which is what you would expect, right? And I think that almost captures the problem in South Africa. So really, and I'm going to wrap up in 2 sentences, is what we really require now is a kind of a new gathering of political and legal mobilization. And part of that, and this is really what in the end I think a lot of my paper will talk to, is really a kind of political and legal development of the idea of choice within the constrained circumstances and structural conditions in which women find themselves. And there are now lots of very nice ethnographic studies given HIV/AIDS in South Africa about the kinds of choices that women are exercising around relationships, sex, pregnancy, termination, that really can provide the context for arguing for constitutional and legal ideas of choice and political ideas of choice that I think will sustain a new movement to try and expand access in South Africa once more. Thank you.
Obrigada, professora Cat. É impressionante como a experiência da África do Sul e dos movimentos feministas e da articulação da sociedade civil nos inspiram e guardam similaridades com a experiência brasileira em relação ao aborto inseguro e às dificuldades de se implementar as relações e as políticas, né, as políticas públicas de aborto legal, né? Isso no Brasil também, estava conversando aqui com a professora Débora, que eu acho que tem dados incríveis, né, do quão escondido é esse serviço no Brasil. E é muito interessante conhecer as resistências que vocês sofreram para a gente tentar contorná-las numa estratégia brasileira de ampliação do aborto ou da interrupção da gestação. Eu acho que não há termo que vá fazer mais fácil a nossa luta, mas, ainda assim, é muito importante ter a sua experiência. Muito obrigada.